Good morning, Living Stones Church. And again, it's a wonderful privilege to be able to speak to you today as we're going through this mini-series called Tough Questions for Christians. And today's tough question is, are faith and science incompatible? But before we begin, I want to reiterate, as we heard last week, that in seeking to answer the tough questions, sometimes we need to take a deep breath and listen with an open heart, and this is what I ask of you today. I've always loved science. I took chemistry, physics and biology O-levels when I was at school. I was the only girl in my physics class and the first girl to pass O-level physics in the school. I particularly loved chemistry, and just for fun I learnt the periodic table off by heart. I loved astronomy and was completely fascinated by the rings of Saturn, red dwarfs and black holes. I guess I was a bit of a nerd, and I probably still am. Given my love of science, if faith and science are incompatible, then I'm in a lot of trouble. I'm a Bible studies teacher who loves science. I must be conflicted constantly, but I'm not. And I know that I'm not alone. The history of science is a catalogue of men and women of faith, from the very creation of the scientific method itself to the leading edge of science today. Roger Bacon and William of Ockham, two medieval Franciscan friars, created the scientific method, which is an empirical method for acquiring knowledge that has characterised the development of science. The scientific method involves careful observation coupled with rigorous skepticism, because assumptions can distort the interpretation of the observation. Scientific inquiry includes creating a hypothesis through reasoning, testing it through experiments and statistical analysis, and adjusting or discarding the hypothesis based on the results. It is still widely used today. Robert Boyle, memorialised in Boyle's Law, for which those who are interested is a gas law. His law is used today in the explanation how the breathing system in the human body works. But apart from being a scientist, Boyle was heavily invested in evangelism and Bible translation. St. Hildegard of Bingen was an 11th century German Benedictine abbess and botanist who is considered the founder of natural history. She systematically described and documented plants in Germany and wrote many books about the healing properties of plants. Galileo, a 16th century Italian astronomer and physicist, was a devout Christian who wrote extensively on theology. Interestingly, it was his scientific beliefs, such as the sun and not the earth was the centre of the solar system, were the reasons for him standing trial as a heretic. Isaac Newton, 18th century English acclaimed multi-field scientist, famous for his laws on gravity, believed in God and defended a theistic view of creation, that God created everything we see. Michael Faraday, an 18th century English scientist who contributed massively to the study of electromagnetism and electrochemistry, is considered to be one of the greatest experimental scientists ever. He wrote about the relationship between his Christian faith and the science he was pursuing. Lord Kelvin, 19th century Northern Irish mathematician, from whom we get the Kelvin unit of temperature, was a devout Christian who attended chapel daily. The inventor of the Big Bang Theory, not the TV series, which points that the universe began as this incredibly hot, incredibly dense point that exploded and created the known universe. That man was a 20th century Belgian Roman Catholic priest, Georges Lemaitre. The father of modern genetics, Gregor Mendel, was a 19th century Austrian Czech Roman Catholic friar who did his pea pod experiments whilst abbot at St. Thomas's Abbey in Brunner. I could go on and on listing luminaries in the scientific community through the ages, all of whom were Christians. The history of science is the history of men and women of faith pursuing science, not in spite of their faith, but because of their faith. They wondered at creation and longed to understand the Creator through it. But we don't have to limit our scientific Christians to the past. There are plenty of examples today too. In the United States, Francis Collins, the former director of the Institute of Health and the former head of the Human Genome Project, is just one example. He is the longest serving presidentially appointed NIH director, having served 3 US presidents of different parties for over more than 12 years. He did not grow up a Christian, but was led to faith in life by one of his female patients. Though terminally ill and in severe pain, she always appeared at peace. He asked her why this was, and she started to explain the gospel to him and tell him about Jesus. Then she asked him a question. "Doctor, what do you believe?" And he realised that even though he was an atheist, he had never actually thought through why he was an atheist. He had never actually examined the evidence for God. He began the process of investigating the scriptures and examining the science, and became convinced in his own words, the God of the Bible is the God of the genome. Collins's research and technology made possible the development of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines. In other words, a Christian scientist helped create the vaccines that have saved billions of lives. We must give thanks to our God for Christian scientists across the centuries and across the world. I'd like to present some evidence from scriptures that science and faith are compatible, along with a second, more important point. Not only are science and faith compatible, but the science actually depends on faith. But we will come to that later. One of the greatest difficulties in the Bible is the creation account in Genesis 1, for Christians and for atheists alike. It is often pointed to as the greatest conflict between science and faith. And so what I hope to do is use Genesis 1 as a test case to show how faith and science can be compatible and not in contradiction to each other. Because taken literally, Genesis 1 does not line up with the scientific account about the creation of our world. The Bible seems to describe the entire universe being formed in a matter of a few days, where science claims it to have taken billions of years for the universe to have formed, and then another billion years for life to emerge on our planet. So if you read Genesis 1 as describing 6 24-hour days, there is an immediate conflict between science and faith. But is that actually what the text of Genesis 1 says? Taking a look at Genesis 1 more closely, we can have strong evidence within the text that the days being described are not 24-hour time periods. If I were to pose the question, what is the 24-hour day based on? You would correctly answer that it's the time it takes for the Earth to orbit around the Sun. But in Genesis chapter 1, the Sun isn't created until day 4. Let's read. "And God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years, and let there be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on earth. And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. And he also made the stars. God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and night, and to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the 4th day." So, how was time being measured before day 4? Let's have a look at 2 Peter 3 verse 8. But do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. Peter is not simply giving us a maths lesson. His point is that the eternal God who stands outside of time does not experience time the way we do. As Einstein would later prove, time itself is relative. For those of us who are not God, we still experience time relatively. For children, waiting a week for their birthday seems an eternity, but for those of us in adulthood, weeks, months, and even years seem to pass in the blink of an eye. For some of you, this might be one of those deep breath moments that I mentioned before. So take a deep breath. The Bible does not claim that God created the universe in 6 24-hour periods. That belief is based on a poor reading of the text that is contradicted by the text itself. And furthermore, this belief in a 6-day creation and of Earth, and that an Earth is only about 10,000 years old, is a fairly recent innovation. Like I said, take a deep breath. Most Christians throughout history did not believe that. It wasn't until the 18th century that such a belief began to come about. So Christians had been around for about 1700 years before calculating the Earth that way was conceived. And it wasn't even a popular concept until 1923, when George Macready Price, a 20th century Canadian creationist and Seventh-day Adventist, produced several anti-evolution and creationistic works, particularly on the subject of flood geology. His views did not become common among creationists until after his death, particularly with modern creation science movement starting in the 1960s. His work argued for a young Earth. Many Christians subsequently latched onto it. Of course, I want to make it clear that God most definitely could have created the world in 6 24-hour time periods. And if you do hold that belief too, then that's totally fine. But I do want to say that it's much more magnificent that God patiently formed the vast universe over billions of years. Because remember, He is outside of our concept of time. It tells us that God is far more intimately involved and committed to His creation than we could possibly fathom. This is the main thrust of Genesis 1. Not that God couldn't do things with the snap of His fingers. Of course He could do that. But that God took His time with creation and celebrated over every part of it from beginning to end. And if the point were to show us that God could do incredible things quickly, why have 6 days of creation? Why not just have one? The whole point is this beautiful refrain that we see throughout Genesis 1 at the end of each stage of creation. He admires His work and says, "It is good." I like to think of God standing there with a huge smile on His face, admiring His work and saying, "It is good." This isn't a scientific account. Science can't tell us what is good and what is bad. Genesis 1 is a poetic liturgy revealing a creator totally in love with his creation, and that as He is creating the creation, He is celebrating and rejoicing and saying, "It is good." Last week I said one of the most dangerous things we can do is to take the Bible literally in those places where it is not intended to be taken literally. God could have given us a very detailed scientific account of the creation of the universe, full of physics formulas and phenotypes. But this would be far too small and unimportant. Let me give you an example. When my boys were young and I took them into bed, I could have said to them, "You are a combination of my DNA with another mammal's DNA, and you are a collection of cells with an expiration date." This would have been a scientifically true statement to make, but it wouldn't be meaningful or important. The truth my boys needed to hear when I took them into bed at night was this: you are my child and I love you. There's nothing scientific about that statement, but it is true. Far more true than them knowing they are mammals comprised of decaying cells. In the same way, God opens important truth we need to know as human beings. Sorry about that, I lost the connection momentarily. I hope it's all back now. So I'll start that paragraph again. In the same way, God opens the Bible with the most important truth we need to know as human beings. Not formulas and phenotypes, but we have a Creator who lovingly creates all that is seen and unseen. Genesis 1 is not primarily about the creation, it is primarily about the Creator, revealing who He is. There is much in life that science cannot give an account of. Science can explain the colours of the sunset, but it can't tell us why the sunset is beautiful. Science can tell us the physics and mathematics of music, but it can't tell us what makes certain sounds a song and why we love to sing those songs. Science deals with measurables, things that can be measured. Faith deals in meaning, and meaning cannot be measured. But just because meaning cannot be measured, it does not mean that everything is meaningless. Science can't tell us meaning, but it can point us towards meaning. It can be a signal, a signpost behind it all. As we investigate the world around us, we see God's fingerprints all over His creation. There are many other scientists like Francis Collins who discovered that the God of the Bible is the God of the genome. Faith and science are compatible. That is what we are discovering. We have been fed an untruth by our culture that science is a completely objective and faithless enterprise. There is nothing objective about science. It is utterly subjective. And here's what I mean by that. Science begins from a perspective of human subjects trying to make sense of the world around us. We don't stand objectively outside of creation and look at it and try to study it. We are within that creation. We are within the world we are trying to study. But all science assumes that there is something behind all creation. Science assumes that the universe is consistent and that there are rationally discernible laws of physics and nature that are true everywhere and for all time. This assumption in itself is a leap of faith. In other words, there is nothing within science that can prove that there should be an ordered universe, yet science spends its time trying to prove it. Alistair McGrath, a Northern Irish theologian, Anglican priest, scientist and Christian apologist, and author of Conflict or Mutual Enrichment, Why Science and Theology Need to Talk to Each Other, puts it this way: in my own time as a scientist, impressed upon me the way that science is able to investigate a universe that is both rationally transparent and imaginatively beautiful, capable of being represented in an elegant mathematical form. One of the most significant parallels between the natural sciences and Christian theology is the fundamental conviction that the world is characterized by regularity and intelligibility. I'm sure you know what I mean. There is something strange about the world itself and the human mind that allows the patterned regularity within nature to be discerned, represented and understood. Let me put it another way. There is no reason to suspect that the universe is reasonable and ordered, unless you believe there is a creator who made it reasonable and ordered. There is no reason why we should suspect that science just assumes it as a given, and there is no reason to think that we could even understand the universe unless you believe that the universe could be understood. We have to assume that it is understandable, that it is intelligible. This is a faith claim that all scientists are making by the very nature of what they are trying to do. They are saying there are laws that apply across all time and everywhere. These are the laws, and we are going to discover what those laws are. There is a reason why Christians like Roger Bacon and William of Ockham developed the scientific method. They believed that a reasonable God had ordered the universe so that reasonable creatures, such as ourselves, should be able to discover the structures of the universe, that we should be able to understand God as we understand those structures. Science arose out of Christianity because of a faith in a creator who ordered that creation. If we look at Psalm 19, this indicates that this is one of our core convictions. The heavens declare the glory of God. The skies proclaim the work of his hands. Day after day, they pour forth speech. Night after night, they reveal knowledge. They have no speech. They have no words. No sound is heard from them. Yet their voice goes out into all the earth, their words to the ends of all the world. What is it that the creation is revealing? It is revealing God. Christians and scientists both believe that the natural world is ordered and that we can discover that order. That is the common ground we share, and in a sense, it's the common faith claim that we share. There's a great interview with Albert Einstein from 1930, and in that interview he was asked if he were an atheist, and he responded by the way of a parable. Your question is the most difficult in the world. It's not a question I can answer simply with a yes or a no. I'm not an atheist. I do not know if I can define myself as a pantheist. The problem involved is too vast for our limited minds. May I reply with a parable? The human mind, no matter how highly trained, cannot grasp the universe. We are in the position of a little child entering a huge library whose walls are covered to the ceiling with books in many different tongues. The child knows that someone must have written those books. It does not know who or how. It does not understand the languages in which they are written. The child notes a definite plan in the arrangement of the books, a mysterious order which it does not comprehend, but only dimly suspects. That, it seems to me, is the attitude of the human mind, even the greatest and most cultured, toward God. We see a universe marvellously arranged, obeying certain laws, but we understand the laws only dimly. Our limited minds cannot grasp the mysterious force that sways the constellations. Although Albert Einstein was not a Christian, I'm inclined to agree with what he said above. That is a fully reasonable summary of what it is like to be human, trying to understand the Creator. He speaks of the mystery that we can read in Colossians 1:15-17. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, and we could even interject here the laws of thermodynamics. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. Christians believe that the Creator God is making himself known in and through his creation. Whether scientists admit it or not, each discovery they make is one more signpost pointing to a Creator behind the creation. John 1 says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning, and through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it." Last week we were looking at metaphors in the Bible, and verse 3 uses light and darkness. If we think of some of the phrases in which we use light, for example, to bring something to light, meaning to make something known or to expose something, to see the light, to finally realise something, to see the light of day, to be born, to become known, or to be available to the public, to throw light on, to explain something by providing more information. And then let's do the same for dark or darkness. In the dark, to be uninformed or unaware of something, cloaked in darkness, hidden or concealed. And something struck me. The verses above are from the NIV UK version, but if we read verse 5 in many other versions, the original Greek word for overcome, katalabian, is translated in the King James Version, the New King James Version, the Catholic Douay-Rheims Bible, and the 1526 Tyndale Bible as comprehend. In the New American Standard Version, it is translated as grasp. In the Literal Standard Version and Young's Literal Translation, perceive, and in the Amplified Version as understood. Thus, we can read verse 5 as, the light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not comprehended, grasped, perceived, or understood it. Faith is the light. Faith is science yet to be comprehended, grasped, perceived, or understood. But with each new discovery, more of God's creation is revealed. Christians believe that God is making himself known through his creation, that you can look into the natural world and see his fingerprints all over it. But we also believe something more. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. Of all of the many wonders of God, this is the real miracle in creation. One of the most amazing things about Genesis 1 is that you see the Creator standing outside of time, outside of his creation. He created everything and put everything into existence out of that huge, vast array of creation. He chose to become one of us. He chose to become a human. God so wanted to be known by us that he not only put his fingerprints over all creation, but he put his image into the creation in the person of his Son, Jesus Christ. That is wonderful. That is amazing. And that is something that science can't point us to. The one thing that we can discover, that Jesus is here. He is with us. God has come to be with us. Not just content to have signposts to come to himself and offer himself to us. Let's consider the implications of this. What does it mean for us today? Firstly, science is not the enemy of faith. We don't have to be afraid of science. All truth is God's truth. All facts are friendly. If we believe that our claims about the Creator are true, then we should never be afraid or defensive when it comes to seeking the truth. I have to admit there has been times in the past when I have been defensive of a Christian, when I've been confronted with tough questions. But the response of the Christian shouldn't be to become defensive and angry and upset, but to patiently engage in seeking the truth, even with those outside of the church. Jesus says, seek and you will find, knock on the door and it will be open to you. We can make common cause with anyone who is seeking truth, even an atheist scientist. And this does not mean that all the discoveries of science will turn out to be everlastingly true or correct. Science is always undergoing the process of disproving itself. Science, by its very nature, is fallible, but it can be a useful tool for pointing us to the truth, and we should never, living stones, fear the truth. Science has grown out of faith. It was begun by Christians and can point us towards the Creator behind the creation. Lastly, I want to invite you, living stones, to wonder. I'm afraid that in our overly anxious and embittered culture, we have lost our sense of wonder. Just in the last 50 years, we have been we have been making astonishing discoveries. We have peered into the very smallest parts of God's creation. We have gone beyond atoms, once thought to be the smallest particles, and discovered quarks and leptons. We have looked out beyond our own solar system, our own galaxy, and gazed into the depths of a universe, and to the not so snappily named GNZ11, a high-shift red galaxy found in the constellation Ursa Major. It is the farthest known galaxy from Earth, some 32 million light years away. We have expanded our view of the ever-expanding universe. But how often do you gaze at creation in wonder? How often do we take up this mantle, handed down to us by generations of saints who gazed in wonder at the natural world around them and said, I want to know more about the God that created this. Take some time this week to look at the wonder of the world, at our wonderful God, and the greatest wonder of it all, that out of this vast array of creation, the entirety of the universe, God chose to become a human, to live and die of one of us, so that we might know him and his incredible love and delight for us. The God who created everything died for us and rose to a new life that he might make all things new. Even this bag of cells with an expiration date, and maybe even especially this bag of cells with an expiration date. Out of his vast creation, the Creator came to us because he loves us. Now, that is a real wonder. Thank you so much for listening, Living Stones. Have a blessed week. God bless you all.